Hello and welcome. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Engineered Food Podcast. If you're just joining this podcast, let me give you some background to bring you up to speed. This is a different approach to thinking about food and what makes it appealing. I'm a real engineer with a Bachelor of Science degree, which means I spent a lot of time thinking about and working on physics problems, calculus, and probabilities. And frankly, this, along with my interest in cooking and food and eating in particular, I think uniquely qualifies me to offer some factual opinions about food and what might make it appealing to all of us. So let's continue our journey through Mexican restaurants in Northwest Ohio and let's order some cheese nachos. The date, March 18th, 2022, and we visited the Cancun Mexican restaurant in Findlay, Ohio. It was another busy Friday night, and we arrived just before the rush and were seated at one of the last open tables before the line in the lobby started to form. We were seated and waited upon immediately by a charming young man who was all about business. It seemed like a matter of minutes. We had a margarita in front of us, had ordered our food, and nachos were on their way. Like most restaurants that you've never visited before, you really don't know what you're going to get when you order nachos. Uh, they seem to come in two different types generally. They're the solid cheese type melted on top of tortilla chips, or the liquid cheese type where the cheese is poured on top of the chips. Our visit to Cancun Mexican restaurant was an example of the latter. Very similar to the El Zarape experience with liquid cheese poured on top of crispy tortillas. The plate arrived piping hot, which made the cheese even thinner than the El Zarape experience from last week. Since cheese begins to melt at 90 degrees Fahrenheit, a piping hot plate is a recipe for a messy nacho appetizer. The tortillas themselves seemed perfectly formed, which led me to believe that they were probably commercially made and not homemade. Nonetheless, they were crisp and crunchy and very tasty. The nachos were a normal size, which seems to now be about 2.5 inches wide, just big enough to put the entire chip in your mouth at one time and consume it, minimizing the amount of mess as the cheese is likely to roll off of the chip as you bite into it. As nacho chips go, this is thinner than most, measuring about 1/16 of an inch. Good news is that gives it a nice crisp crunch. Bad news, after those chips sit in liquid cheese for more than a few minutes, the crispness goes away and they begin to become a bit soggy. Fortunately for us, the cheese nachos on our plate were largely gone in the first 5 minutes. However, a few of the nachos that stayed on the plate for 7 minutes or more started to get pretty soggy over time. So now that we've had two experiences with liquid cheese, it's probably worth recapping the science that's at work here. Generally, heat reduces the viscosity of cheese and makes it liquid because it breaks down the molecules that hold the cheese together. So, the higher the viscosity, the lower the mobility of the cheese. The unit of measure of viscosity is called the poise, which means to hold in equilibrium. That unit is expressed in millipascals per second. Wow. So after that science lesson, you're saying, I need a margarita. Well, you're in luck. Cancun Mexican restaurant has fabulous frozen margaritas. I rate them a 7 out of 10. In addition, the nachos were plentiful, tasty, came piping hot, and I give the overall experience a 3 sombrero out of 5 rating. And yes, I'll be back. I hope you will too. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. The Engineered Food Podcast is brought to you by Doritos.